Charles looked at the bone spikes that were now flashing with gray light. They were actually unstained from the black beetle's flesh and blood. He smiled in his heart. What he had expected was indeed right. This bone spike had been infused with his power of thunder. That was because the bone spike absorbed with the medicinal black beetle's toxicity and the infernal energy in his body. Hence, after it was extracted, it was instead completely clean. It looked spotless, not even bearing a drop of black blood. His movements were extremely efficient. The other medicinal black beetles didn't even have the time to react. Only after this first bug fell did the other medicinal black beetles become attracted to him. They howled and rushed forward. The black beetle's body wasn't small. It was at least the size of an adult tiger, and its speed was also extremely fast. It opened its bloody mouth, and a foul stench filled the air. "We've got to be quick," said Alice, urged Tony, who was stunned by the scene. Tony came back to his senses and quickly followed Alice into the building. By the time the two of them ran inside, Charles had already killed the third black beetle. The blue shield on his body also had some cracks. Clearly, he could not hold on any longer. "No, I don't have enough spiritual strength. I can't use my power of thunder to keep a water shield around him anymore." Alice, who was watching the battle at the entrance of the school building, looked horrified by her inability to help further. If she hadn't used so much energy saving those spineless students before, her water screen shield would have been able to last even longer. Charles had been right. She did feel like she'd wasted her powers. When Charles pulled out the bone spurs, the fourth black beetle slowly fell to the ground. The blue light barrier around his body suddenly shattered. "Looks like I'll have to defend myself." Another one of the black beetles let out a strange cry. Currently, there were only 2 black beetles left. In terms of speed, Charles was much faster than the black beetle, but that was only a matter of bodily speed. It didn't account for his opponent's projectile vomiting. The black beetles were capable of spitting an unknown venom at lightning speed. If they were able to hit Charles with it, the stench would likely kill him before the intense poison even had a chance to work its evil magic. Charles spat out a mouthful of medicinal essence bloods. "He spit up blood again," said Tony. "Why does he have to do that before attacking anyway?" Tony had a strange expression on his face. He didn't quite understand what was going on. Zach was clearly controlling the fire. Alice, who was beside him, drove the water with a wave of her hand. Why was Charles so unusual? I'm not sure, but I remember learning that there's only one saint-level spell that can be activated by essence bloods. It was part of the knowledge that I was delivered. Alice also wore a strange expression and said, "But Charles obviously can't be at the saint level." "Saint level? What is that? What's your current grade?" "I'm probably dozens of levels away from saint level," Alice answered honestly. Tony was more confused than ever. Meanwhile, Charles spat out yet another mouthful of essence blood. He was going to start drawing extract amulets again. This time, he drew a defensive extract amulet. What made him feel somewhat regretful was this medicinal essence blood. If he had the 4th strand of origin energy in his body, he would need to waste the essence blood. Just using origin energy to draw an amulet was enough to lay down a defensive amulet that could stop the black beetle. But now, he had no other choice. Because he had absorbed the medicinal bloody corpses and crystal cores, he still couldn't fuse the 4th strand of origin energy. However, he could sense that he was just a step away from the 4th strand of origin energy. After killing these few black beetles, their medicinal crystal cores would definitely be able to help him take this step and fuse the 4th strand of origin energy into his body. Imperial Extract Amulet. In the blink of an eye, it was completed. His body began to glow with resplendent golden light, dazzling the others. "Wow," whispered Alice. "Now that's a cool move," said Tony, eyes widening. "It looks like a golden god." The black beetle's claw struck the golden light as if it had connected with incomparably hard steel. Charles's movements were incomparably swift. He rushed toward the 2 black beetles, brandishing the bone spurs. 2 swooshes later, the final black beetles turned into a puff of black smoke, dying instantly. Charles didn't stop moving. He quickly collected the black beetles' crystal cores and ran to the door while quickly absorbing them. Arriving at the door, He stopped the other two before they could speak. He urged them, "Quick, the extract amulet only lasts for 10 minutes. We can't waste it." And with that, he left the two of them eating dust. He had already climbed the stairs. "So fast," Tony muttered to himself, and immediately followed after Alice. Charles had already cleared several floors. When he was on the 4th floor, he stopped, because he saw an acquaintance. It seemed he had to waste a few minutes. A cold smile appeared on Charles's face as he walked over. The two people behind him also rushed over quickly. They panted heavily as they looked toward the other end of the corridor. "Director Benson? Principal Lee?" The two men looked at each other and quickly followed. "This student came at the right time. Quick, quick, quick! There's a monster in the classroom. Quickly go and help." Director Benson was wearing a pair of gold-rimmed glasses. He looked weak and frail. However, Charles knew that this seemingly weak henchman was a ruthless man, just as bad as the principal, maybe even worse. Charles almost laughed out loud as his heart filled with bloodlust. Just as Charles approached, preparing to attack Principal Lee first, the entire building seemed to shake. A thunderous hiss carried down the hall. A monster with pitch-black wings and claws that looked like the tip of a knife suddenly appeared in the classroom next to them. This monster looked like a praying mantis. It was a Mantia Nigra. The Mantia Nigra was the army of the Worm Clan, and its strength was far greater than that of a black beetle. The bloody tip of its blade shone under the moonlight, composing the perfect image of horror. "Quick, students!" cried Principal Lee, running toward the stairs with Director Benson. "Quick! Stop it!" In the classroom, several students were huddled. They were also holding metal rods, shovels, and other makeshift weapons, which they weighed before the Mantia Nigras. Despite the fight they were putting up, though, everyone was clearly terrified. Most of them were shaking like leaves. Quick as a flash, Charles extended his hand and blocked Principal Lee and Director Benson's path. With a grim smile on his face, he said in a tone as cold as winter, "Where do you think you're going, guys? We need you up on the front line."
"Young man," said Director Benson, "I have an even more important mission. Hurry up and block it. I'll go and find those students who know magic to help you." Taking a closer look, the director's eyes lit up. "This golden light on your body? You've also awakened magic, right? Quick, block that monster!" Director Benson didn't recognize Charles at first glance, but he didn't care who it was. His one and only goal was self-preservation. After all, as Principal Lee's hardworking lackey, he was famous in the school. Or infamous, rather. Despite Director Benson practically pushing him away, Charles didn't move an inch. Instead, he shoved the two of them backward, knocking them to the ground. Principal Lee's expression changed quickly. He swung his fierce face and shouted, "What the hell are you doing, kid? Do you know who we are?" "Of course," said Charles, raising his eyebrows. A moment later, the bone spike pierced Principal Lee's thigh. At the same time, he said, "I know exactly who you are." Principal Lee howled in agony. "Ah!" His heart turned cold. This student had actually dared to injure him. Meanwhile, Director Benson fell to the ground, stunned. This was the first time he had seen such a reckless student. His attack was swift and decisive, without the slightest bit of hesitation. Seeing Charles's face, which was cold as ice, Benson's rage subsided, suddenly replaced by fear. It was even more terrifying than the fear caused by the monster. Charles pulled out the bone spur and turned toward the director. "I know who you are, too." And with that, he plunged the spur into Benson's thigh. Both of them screamed in pain. "Son, what is the meaning of this?" whimpered Lee. "Charles. My name is Charles." Tony and Alice had already walked over. Their faces were contorted. They didn't understand why Charles would do such a thing. Ah! Oh! On the other side, the tip of the Mantia Nigra flashed, and a few of the students surrounding the creature instantly died. Charles naturally noticed it as well. Right now, these two scumbags had already lost their ability to escape. He forgot about the Mantia Nigra and rushed over. At the same time, he said to Tony and Alice, who had rushed over behind him, "You two go and find Zach and the others." "No! You two, save us!" screeched Benson. "That student has gone mad! He's crazy! He wants to kill the principal! He must be crazy! Tony, you're a member of the martial arts department. Do you still remember? I signed your application myself. Quick, carry me! I can't leave! Carry me on your back!" Tony frowned. This was only part of the story. He had signed the contract, but wasn't that only because he'd given him a gift? To be honest, Tony didn't have a good impression of the principal and the director, but he still couldn't bear to watch the two of them die. Alice looked to be concentrating. Water of life. Bathing. The blue light returned. Charles could feel the movement of the power of thunder. Alice's spiritual strength had obviously been overused. If she forcefully activated it now, it would cause great harm to her body. Charles shouted, "Tony, stop her!" But Tony looked troubled. Charles stopped and shouted at Alice, "Alice, you can be kind, but you can't save these two." However, Alice acted as if she hadn't heard it. Charles immediately turned around, ran over to Alice, and carried her off. Alice lost her balance and exclaimed when she saw that she was being carried away by Charles. Forcefully stopping Alice's magic, Charles said unhappily, "You've used up enough spiritual strength. If you forcefully drive it, your body will be overdrawn and you'll faint." "Charles, I know that I wasn't wrong. I know you're not a bad person. Have a little heart." Charles frowned. He put Alice down and said slowly, "I will explain to you later. Allow me to kill that bug first." This trip had wasted a lot of time. Charles turned around again. Two more students had been cut down by the blade of the Mantia Nigra. The Mantia Nigra's long tongue stretched out and licked the blood off the tip of the blade, slurping loudly. Amongst the group, there were two Awakens. One of them was an Earth-type superpower. Every time the terrifying blade of the Mantia Nigra attacked, he would be the one to block it, protecting the others. However, it was obvious that he wasn't familiar with his superpowers. Moreover, the consumption of spiritual strengths was too high. Cold sweat appeared on his face. His legs were trembling. The other students retreated in fear. They all wanted to go up, but didn't dare to. "Those aren't Awakens. All of you back off. Leave this place to me." The golden light on Charles's body shocked all of the students' titanium eyes. They all moved aside and backed away. What a bright golden light! It's Charles! Charles, did you awaken your metal-type superpower? Charles didn't say a word, focusing on the Mantia Nigra's attack range. The Mantia Nigra hissed and pointed two blades at Charles. Then, without warning, they stabbed straight at him. "Charles, get out of the way! This monster is very powerful!" In the eyes of the other students, this Mantia Nigra was devoid of any weakness. It was impossibly tough and fast, even capable of flight. Charles, however, had already come to understand all of its attacks. After all, he had fought these things for a good decade. Okay, a really bad decade. Charles didn't care about its blade-like claws. He allowed them to stab at him. Of course, Charles wouldn't let himself get hit, though. He squatted down slightly and jumped into the air. As he did so, the bone spur shot out, aimed at the Mantia Nigra's lower body. The bottom was, in fact, its weakness. The weakness of the Mantia Nigra was extremely difficult to find. Moreover, even if one found it, it wasn't easy to reach. The only way was to fight in close combat. Two cracks appeared on the bug's body, and with a roar, the Mantia Nigra flapped its wings, soon taking flight. A moment later, it smashed the ceiling above its head, reducing it to rubble. He actually blocked it? The student who had awakened his Earth power was surprised. The knowledge in his mind told him that Earth power was the best defense among all awakened powers. As for Metal power, shouldn't it be the best attack power? No matter how hard he tried, though, he couldn't resist the powerful force. The golden light actually blocked it without any injuries. Looking at the trembling tip of the Mantia Nigra's claws, the student could see that it was actually hit by the rebounding force. How is this possible? "You two, don't just stand there. Quick! Attack the lower body of the bug. Focus on its butt." Charles had already stood up from the ground. The attack certainly hadn't achieved the desired effect. However, it had successfully caused the Mantia Nigra to take flight. In order to avoid his attack, the Mantia Nigra had opened itself up to a fatal attack. Its lower body is its weakness, shouted Charles, looking toward the two awakened students. Earth Rock Spike. Swordlight Slash! Charles saw two extremely familiar attacks suddenly appear. The Earth Rock Spike was suffused with gray light and protruded from the floor. Its target was very clear, and it stabbed fiercely toward the Mantia Nigra's hindquarters. The Swordlight was faster. After all, the body surgery type was paranormal. Naturally, they had an advantage in terms of speed. Unfortunately, he hadn't really used a sword before. Therefore, this move only had its shape and no particular power. It was fast, too fast for the Mantia Nigra to dodge. But upon piercing the bug's body into the Mantia Nigra's body, it broke down immediately, flowing like mud straight into the sea. Students of the sword-type body technique, stop attacking, cried Charles. Charles followed the flow of Power of Thunder and took a glance at the sword-type body technique possessor, with the most destructive power. He had long black hair that looked like a waterfall. He had a delicate, charming face and looked to be in his 20s. He had long legs, a slender waist, and great So, she was a female classmate. Wait a minute. Could it be? Miranda? Sure enough, it was the legend herself. In Charles's previous life, he had never heard any news about Miranda awakening like this. It was all too unexpected. Yet, now wasn't the time to stand around rubbernecking local celebs. The medicinal Mantia Nigra emitted a roar. Although it had blocked the swordlight earlier, the blazing energy contained within it had still caused unseen damage. Its blade-like claws tore downward hatefully. A rock spike that looked very hard was actually cut into pieces by the Mantia Nigra's blade tip, splattering in all directions. The soil was thrown in all directions. The others all raised their weapons, prepared for the worst. The Mantia Nigra, still above them, let out a vengeful roar. Just in time, the layer of golden light in front of Charles blocked the Mantia Nigra. His head was spinning rapidly, though. How could he take this thing down? If the Mantia Nigra flew up, only long-range attacks would prove effective. However, the current him seemed to have a limited range when it came to long-range attacks. Even if he drew extract amulets, it was almost impossible. The scene before his eyes seemed to have turned into a dead end, and Charles prepared himself to die for the second time. The Mantia Nigra arrogantly hovered above them, letting out a rumbling sound that almost sounded like laughter. However, the Mantia Nigra still had some intelligence. It wouldn't take the initiative to attack. It was watching Charles's every move with extreme vigilance from above. For a time, they remained in a deadlock. Power of Thunder surged out. Charles tried to transfer Power of Thunder into the Bone Spur. However, the energy shot right out again. It couldn't merge with the Bone Spurs, making it impossible for Charles to use. Although the Bone Spurs had the possibility of fusing with Power of Thunder, it seemed like it just wasn't enough at the moment. He didn't know what was lacking. Since that was the case, Charles scanned his surroundings. Although the students were afraid, they stood their ground, watching the Mantia Nigra carefully. These students all had some serious courage. After seeing Miranda's delicate figure, Charles suddenly had a flash of inspiration. Yes! He quickly walked over and passed the bone spurs to Miranda, saying, "Don't slash, try to harness the power." Use this? Miranda was first stunned. Looking at the white weapon that looked like a skeleton, she frowned slightly and said in confusion, "What should I do?" "It's like making any other move," said Charles. He just let the vitality gather in the bone spur. Hovering above, the Mantia Nigra flapped its black wings. It didn't know what these two little creatures were doing, but it was displeased nonetheless. Its green eyes rolled a few times, but in the end, it didn't dare to rush down. It remained in place, waiting to see what would happen. "I'll try." Miranda followed Charles's instructions and circulated the surrounding Power of Thunder, causing it to gather in front of her again. This time, it didn't turn into swordlight, though. Instead, it slowly turned into a thin layer of bubbles on the bone spike. Go! Swordlight chop! Compelled by Miranda's thought, the bone spurs quietly disappeared. Quick, thought Charles. Extremely fast. This sword strike was actually faster than the previous one had been. The sound barrier was smashed, and a supersonic crack followed. The bone spikes had already pierced into the Mantia Nigra's weak spot. A black and green liquid spurted out as the Mantia Nigra let out a miserable howl. It was already vigilant enough. However, it was still so fast that it didn't even have time to react before it was struck by that sword light. It hit! "Miss Ellington!" cried one student. "You hit it!" "Nice!" yelled another. "Superhero teacher!" There was a burst of applause from below. The Mantia Nigra felt a surge of unprecedented pain. Pain that made it wish it were dead. It was burning up and had a swelling feeling in its chest. Flailing wildly, it crashed into the wall. One wall crumbled, followed by another, the second exposing open air and a vast world. The Mantia Nigra suddenly flew out. "Quick, don't let it escape!" yelled Charles. The bone spurs were wreaking havoc in its body. Now's the time to strike. Miranda's face turned red with excitement. She didn't even have time to respond to Charles. Under her control, the bone spikes tore through the creature's body, leaving destruction in its wake. The monster's exterior was strong, but its internal organs were fragile as could be. Under the explosive thunder power essence of heaven and earth, no part could survive. The Mantia Nigra suddenly exploded, no more now than a mound of meat. "Quick, bring that shiny stone back." When Miranda heard this, she nodded her head and urged the bone spurs to pierce through the medicinal crystal core and bring it back together. There was no stinky flesh or blood on the bone spurs. The interior emitted a crystalline light. Charles grabbed the bone spurs and crystal core and started to absorb them on the spot. Whether the force trace of origin energy was successfully condensed or not depended on this medicinal crystal core. It was just about time for a proper upgrade. "And you are?" Miranda called softly, but she couldn't hear Charles's response. The students encircled her excitedly. "Miss Ellington is great! Miranda Ellington, all hail the Queen!" The students were filled with passion. They didn't know how many people the Mantia Nigra had eaten raw and swallowed alive, but the students were naturally very grateful to Miranda. If it hadn't been for her, they all would have died. All of them shouted Miranda's name excitedly. However, only Miranda, who was at the center, knew what had really just happened. This had nothing to do with her at all. All she did was twist out the sword light. The one controlling the battle was actually Charles, who had remained on the sidelines. Without his guidance, she wouldn't have been able to succeed. But how did Charles do it? He was very clear about the sword attribute body skill that he had awakened. Miranda was utterly curious. Didn't he possess a metal-type superpower? In the past, this Charles kid hadn't struck her as outstanding in any way. He was just a very ordinary student. So what was going on? Moving quickly, Charles finished absorbing the medicinal crystal core from the black iron mantis. Along with the energy from the medicinal black beetle he'd absorbed earlier, it gathered in his chest. He wanted to convert this energy into the fourth trace of origin energy. 1 circle, 2 circles. The energy circulated through his body. Then, led by the first 2 strands of origin energy, it slowly began to change. When the 4th circle was completed, the 4th trace of Power of Thunder was also condensed. He let out a long breath. It was finally complete. The 4th strand of origin energy appeared. Now, he could truly call himself a power artist. One couldn't underestimate the effect of the 4th stream of origin energy. This was the capital for a power artist to truly stand up. Like the last leg of a table, vitally important. He could use origin energy to temper his body, making himself stronger and stronger. The most important thing was that he no longer needed to use essence bloods to draw amulets. 4 streams of Power of Thunder. That would be enough for the lowest consumption of extract amulets. The golden light on his body also dissipated. The time for the medicinal extract amulets had also arrived. He opened his eyes and saw the students surrounding Miranda and chattering away. However, Miranda was looking at him. Catching his gaze, she walked over in his direction. "Charles, aren't you a metal-type magic-powered person? How do you know my sword-type superpower?" Charles didn't listen to her at all. He quickly walked outside and said perfunctorily, "We'll talk about it later." Miranda frowned slightly. This Charles's attitude toward her had long been a little cold. When the zombie tide had just arrived, as a teacher, she spent her time comforting students in the girls' dorm. That's the kind of person she was, empathetic. Sure, he'd helped her out just now, but this boy was still so detestable. Thinking as much, Miranda looked Charles up and down with evident displeasure. They went into the corridor. Principal Lee and Director Benson were still there, leaning against a wall, now surrounded by a cluster of students. The 2 wounds on their thighs had been wrapped with torn cloth to stop the bleeding. Charles quickly walked up to them. One of the students immediately stretched out his arm to stop him. Charles, why did you attack Principal Lee and Director Benson for no reason? What were you thinking? In any case, though, I saw that you stood up for your classmates and stopped that Mantia Nigra. So what the hell? Whose side are you on? Charles frowned, casting an icy look at the man before him. His name was Jake Boyd. Jake Boyd was scared of Charles, but insisted nonetheless. You have to explain why you attacked Principal Lee and Director Benson. If there's no reasonable explanation, we'll have to ask you to leave. Jake is right, Charles. If you don't give me and Principal Lee an explanation, you'll be finished, said Benson, whose eyes were filled with murderous intent. That Mantia Nigra had actually been killed by Miranda, which surprised him more than a little. But at the same time, Benson also heaved a sigh of relief. He knew very well what kind of person Miranda was. Since Miranda was able to kill that Mantia Nigra, it meant that Miranda was much more powerful than this Charles in front of her, and she'd, no doubt, step in if need be. The kind-hearted Miranda would definitely not let Charles attack him and Principal Lee. Taking comfort in this seeming fact, Director Benson spoke confidently, teeming with typical arrogance. He forced himself to stand up and pointed his finger at Charles with indignation. Then he said, Charles, you must be trying to take petty revenge, right? Is it because I always deducted your points before? Is that why you have a grudge against Principal Lee and me? It just isn't right. 10 years ago, beset by the insects and the cadaver race, rocked by starvation and infighting, their actions had been atrocious. Charles hated small talk. He really hated it. He preferred to use actions to explain himself. In the blink of an eye, the bone spurs flew out, but they were stopped by someone. A thick, solid earthen wall had appeared before him. This was the move of that earth element awakened student from before. A thick earth wall. The awakened pushed through the crowd and walked forward, saying, Charles, what are you trying to do? Charles said coldly, What do you want? Can't you tell? Kill people. Charles's words were chilling. Kill people? The students were all shocked, even though they had already experienced many scenes of death. But that was all because of the bugs and the zombies and the manifold monsters. Right now, a classmate was talking about killing. Kill them? Said Miranda, who'd been following Charles. On what basis? That's right. How did Principal Lee and Director Benson offend you? Asked the other awakened. Even if you stood out to block the Mantia Nigra just now, that doesn't justify killing people casually, said Miranda. Look, said Charles. Everyone can see that I understand exactly what's going on in this world. I've saved everybody's lives several times over, and I'm probably the only chance you have at getting out of here alive. Do I need to explain to you how I do things? Maybe I'll explain my rationale later on, but for now, all you need to know is this. These 2 are wicked and need to die. Principal Lee stood up, now more confident under Miranda's watchful eye. His fear had been blown away at once. His face was now calm and composed. What's bothering you, boy? Tell me and let me guide you, okay? This was what Principal Lee did best. Act. He had a kindly smile on his face, which only just masked his lethal intentions. Charles would never forget the smile on the fatty's face when he and Mitchell White pushed him toward that monster mosquito. It was a smile that would have looked right at home on the devil's mug. Charles felt a chill when he saw it. In his previous life, if it hadn't been for Principal Lee working together with Mitchell White and pushing him to the monster mosquito, things could have been so different. His essence blood and profound energy wouldn't have been completely absorbed by that monster. He would have become a warrior a long time ago. He wouldn't have ended in crushing failure. The main culprit of his previous life's agony stood in front of him, smiling like a savior. He couldn't kill him, though. Not yet. I think you all know what Lee did. Charles couldn't say anything about him pushing him into the monster mosquito, of course. His classmates definitely wouldn't believe him. They'd only peg him as off his rocker. But this Lee fellow was a generally despicable person who had committed numerous evil deeds. Surely too many to count. Forcing a senior student to sleep with him, otherwise he wouldn't allow her to graduate. I believe that you all heard about that, said Charles. He even tried to coerce a teacher from the English department. That teacher refused, and in the end, he made her resign and change schools. You all should have heard about that one, too. Well, said one student, I think I've heard about those rumors. But didn't Principal Lee clarify? Was it just that, a rumor? Whether or not that's true, said another, that's not why you tried to kill Principal Lee. Yeah, that's right. The students were all chiming in at this point. A flash of panic appeared on Michael Lee's face. He quickly covered it up and said, Charles, where did you hear all this fancy gossip? Pure fabrications, my boy. How can you insult someone's innocence out of thin air? I, Michael Lee, have always been conscientious, to the core. I've done my best to lead this school as principal, paying for most of its renovations myself. Nasty, entirely false stories are just a fact of life when you put yourself out there. As Principal Lee spoke, his face didn't turn red, and he didn't run out of breath. He sounded completely sincere all the while, the perfect politician. Out of pocket, eh? Said Charles. Didn't the Ministry of Education allocate $150,000 to the school? Charles wasn't sure if this was a rumor, but he figured it couldn't hurt to throw out there. You, hissed Principal Lee. You're slandering me. Looks like I hit the nail on the head, thought Charles, scanning Lee. You dare to slander Principal Lee without a shred of evidence? Said Benson. Principal Lee is a man of total integrity. He is sincerely looking out for the interest of every single person at this school, students and staff. Every day, the lamp in his room is the last to go out. Director Benson was absurdly loyal to this charlatan. After all, he was a grasshopper on a string. Benson couldn't go anywhere. Of course. That lamp was the last to be extinguished. Of course. The two of them were probably doing all sorts of freaky things together in the dead of night. Charles couldn't hold back any longer. He was about to attack again. Suddenly a violent vibration came from above, though. The entire school building was shaking, seemingly ready to implode. What in the world? Said Charles. This wasn't good. Zach Potter, Calvin Bell, and the others had lured some bugs away under Principal Lee's orders. Now it seemed that something had gone wrong. Surprise, surprise. Charles's body swayed, but he quickly stabilized himself. Miranda's body swayed as well, and her whole body jiggled pleasantly. The male students who had been watching her quietly swallowed saliva in silence. Saving people is more important, Miranda said, looking at Charles. Charles nodded and said, Where are they? The top floor, Miranda replied. Quick. Michael Lee and Director Benson couldn't escape. Once they went out, they'd be surrounded by insects and zombies. Given their abilities, or lack thereof, they couldn't survive without the protection of the awakened students. Therefore, there would always be a chance for Charles to kill them later. At the moment, saving good people was more important than taking out bad ones. Therefore, Charles made a prompt decision and quickly ran upstairs. Miranda and Dale Ulrich, the awakened wielder of the earth element, followed closely behind. Tony, Alice, and 7 or 8 other students followed closely behind. Charles did not care about them behind him. He drove the Divine Line extract amulet himself. His feet suddenly felt like he was stepping on a rocket, and he quickly rushed to the top floor. The Divine Extract Amulet was a beginner-level extract amulet. Its function was to increase one's speed. Therefore, when he reached the top floor, he took off the Divine Extract Amulet so as not to waste it. Then he surveyed the situation. There was a lot of blood, but in one corner of the balcony, over 100 students were being protected by Zach, Calvin, and Denny Peters. Dense monster mosquitoes were swarming overhead, blackening the sky. The monster mosquitoes looked very much like regular mosquitoes, but their bodies were 10 times the size of their pesky counterparts. Their long tips were like needles. Some of the monster mosquitoes' needles had already turned bright red, having sucked up the blood of helpless students. Worse still, there looked to be several mantia nigras in the mix, too. On the ground, there were 2 enormous monsters. These creatures were 15 feet tall and had 8 arms each. Their heads were lion-like, and with each stomp of their massive feet, the ground below shook. The commotion just now was obviously caused by these 2 monsters. "What kind of monster is that?" asked one student. "My God," said another. "We have to run. There's no way we'll ever kill one of those." The crowd behind Zach was crackling with fear. "Don't be afraid," said Calvin. "I said there's light at the end of the tunnel." Just as Calvin finished speaking, a ray of brilliant light lit up the dark night. This ray of light felt almost holy in nature. The students felt some of their fear drift away, and they raised their heads, puffing out their chests. Of course, Charles recognized him. Calvin Bell was a light element paranormal. He couldn't explain the how or why, but under such circumstances, only light element abilities could drive away fear. As for Denny, Charles had forgotten what kind of special ability he had. However, looking at the dark aura that was continuously spreading from his body, Charles was able to make an educated guess. It was most likely dark energy. Denny was surely a necromancer. The skeletons on the ground slowly gathered together with his aura, which proved Charles's guess was right. With just the three of them, though, they were no match for the lion-headed beast, let alone the menagerie of other monsters before them. As if to reinforce this thought, one of the lion-headed beasts roared furiously. Charles stepped forward, drawing extract amulets in his hands. If he'd really had an upgrade, it was time to see what he could do. The students who prepared for battle were all stunned by the loud sound in their ears. They were excited to see Charles approaching quickly, leaving a psychedelic trail behind him. "Charles? Perfect timing! It's Charles!" The after-image behind him was the effect of the extract amulet. In the blink of an eye, Charles stomped his foot, leaped high like a bird, and rapidly approached the lion-headed beast on the right. His body twisted as bone spikes shot forth. Out spurted blood from one of the lion-headed beast's forearms, which had Charles's severed. Then, it fell into the crowd and was grabbed by a student who destroyed it in anger. "Charles, well done!" shouted one of the girls. He'd clearly won her adoration with his show of strength. He landed on the ground, knees slightly bent, and without stopping, jumped out again. "Don't slow down, let's do it," he reminded them at the same time. Oh, Zach looked like he had just woken up from a dream. He looked at the light shield on the left and the lion-headed beast baring its teeth. The fire in front of him condensed, shocking the insects. However, those mantia nigras and monster mosquitoes naturally wouldn't just stand by and watch. As expected, they soon pounced down. The flapping wings produced a buzzing sound, and their needles pierced into a group of people. The students, encouraged by the light magic and full of vigor, raised their fists and tried to resist. Although they had momentum, they lacked strength and were destroyed almost immediately. The crowd dispersed in all directions as the place became a bloodbath. The mantia nigras that had succeeded in their first attack let out strange sizzling laughter while chasing closely behind. The monster mosquito was even more terrifying. Upon piercing a human body, the creatures would rapidly absorb the essence blood's energy, sucking the victim dry, leaving behind a bag of bones. Its white body would turn blood red, and the thing would sway to and fro happily, as if intoxicated. At the entrance of the balcony. Seeing the massacre, Miranda, Alice, Tony, Dale, and the others hurriedly joined the battle. Alice's medicinal spiritual strength had recovered quite a bit, and the water screen shield lit up. The students who survived the mantia nigras and monster mosquitoes approached them. Dale released a thick earth wall to protect some of the students, while Miranda, who only had her killing move the sword light, slashed out, one after another. A monster mosquito that had been caught off guard was immersed in fresh blood. Its body had been torn apart by the sword light, and its liquid scattered all over the place. The other 4 sword lights didn't gain anything. They were swiftly dodged by the monster mosquito. Immediately, their large eyes turned, and 5 medicinal monster mosquitoes targeted Miranda. Miranda shouted to Dale, "Protect me!" The two of them had already experienced a few battles and could be considered to have some tacit understanding. A black wall in front of Miranda blocked the monster mosquito's attack and pushed it several yards away. The wall suddenly dissipated, and a bright aurora light shone on the roof. Extreme light slash! The semicircle seemed to be descending rapidly. From left to right, it only took a breath's time to cut those medicinal monster mosquitoes to the ground. "Whoa!" the students behind Miranda exclaimed. "These mosquitoes don't have high defenses. Kill them quickly!" Miranda sensed it the moment she made her move. Although the medicinal monster mosquitoes looked terrifying, they were as incredibly weak compared to the medicinal Mantia nigris. On the other side, Tony, who didn't awaken any special abilities, held only a metal rod in his hand. Dinging sounds could be heard non-stop. Tony had a foundation in martial arts, so although disadvantaged, he could still barely protect himself. However, when the second monster mosquito bore down on him, he could only dodge. He was both powerless to counterattack and a little careless. He was stabbed in the butt by a medicinal monster mosquito, which sucked his medicinal essence blood upside down. "Quickly, help Tony!" someone cried. In the blink of an eye, 5 students ran up and forcefully pulled the monster mosquito's proboscis out of Tony's butt. Then they fell backward to the ground. The medicinal monster mosquito only took a breath. The tip of the needle was dripping blood. Naturally, it was very unhappy and stabbed at its victim all over again. The students hurriedly dodged as Tony seized the opportunity to swing his staff forward and struck the back of the monster mosquito, knocking it unconscious. On the other side, Charles and the others unleashed their moves. A few skeleton soldiers suddenly appeared and blocked one of the lion-headed beast's long arms. At the same time, the fireball, condensed into an endless flame in front of Zack, shot into the lion-headed beast's body. He thought the fur on their bodies was far from being as thick as the Worm Clan's scales. Just when Zack thought the attack was effective, the burning lion-headed beast ran out of the fire, completely unharmed. He was stunned. What kind of monster is this? Charles once again chopped off one of the front forearms of the lion-headed beast in front of him. At the same time, he observed the battle raging on the other side. "The weakness of these lion-headed beasts is their forearm. You can't do any harm to them if they keep using their forearm." "Got it!" Zack activated the spiritual strength as he gathered his power of thunder and condensed another fireball. This time, his goal wasn't the lion-headed beast's body or fur, but its forearm. The lion-headed beast roared. Of course it could see Zack's intentions. With a wave of its long arm, the skeleton soldiers were swept to the side. They rushed toward Zack. On the other side, the eyes of the lion-headed beast, whose 5 forearms had already been broken, turned red. Charles's movements were too fast. So fast that it couldn't react at all. Just as he was about to attack again, it opened its mouth wide, as if yawning, and a ball of black gas could be seen as it let out a roar. The mass of black gas enveloped Charles. However, he had already expected this. The corners of his mouth curled into a cold smile. He had been waiting for a long time. The bone spike suddenly changed direction. Charles followed the bone spike and didn't only refuse to dodge, but charged toward the lion-headed beast's bloody mouth. His actions were too bold. "Charles!" screamed Calvin, who stood beside Charles looking worried. "Not good!" Calvin Bell's shout was heard clearly by the others. Alice widened her eyes and covered her mouth. Her heart beat faster. Miranda frowned, staring down the hellish beast before her. How can you obtain a tiger cub without entering the tiger's den? Even if they chopped off the lion-headed beast's forearm, it would regenerate quickly with extraordinary strength. Their seeming weakness was actually just camouflage. No matter how many times you cut off their appendages, they would just regrow. Even if you cut off their head, the result would be the same. Their true weakness was their internal organs. Charles had learned as much in his previous life. Only by destroying their internal organs would it be possible to completely kill them. Therefore, he took the opportunity to jump into the lion-headed beast's bloody mouth while enduring the mass of black gas. The black energy wrapped around Charles's body, causing him to endure waves of pain. The black gas penetrated his very cells and blood vessels, meridians, and even internal organs. Every part of his body was eroded by the black gas. Charles spat out a mouthful of blood, tensing in agony. He stepped on the tip of his tongue, which reeked of blood. The lion-headed beast's bloody mouth acted as if it was trying to swallow Charles. Its sharp teeth snapped, dangerously close. Charles didn't dare stop, though. The remaining power of thunder in his body quickly surged out. Using both of his hands and feet, he was able to draw out an extract amulet. Explosive extract amulet. The instant the extract amulet was formed, Charles used all his strength and quickly retreated. He left the extract amulet in the lion-headed beast's mouth, then slid down its tongue into the interior and its body. "Everyone quickly get out of the way," he shouted. He succeeded? What's going on? The lion-headed beast fell into a state of madness, and a pair of wings appeared on its back. It wanted to escape. However, just as it flapped its wings a few times, its body suddenly exploded, as if there'd been a string of firecrackers in its gut. Explosions rang out continuously, crackling wildly. On the other side, another lion-headed beast widened its eyes as it looked in the direction of the exploded one. It let out a wail. Charles didn't know if these two lions were brothers or sisters, or if they had some other relationship. Immediately, the second lion-headed beast went crazy, rushing toward Charles. It charged all the way, shaking off every attack, completely ignoring everyone else. It stood on a pile of minced meat, crying out. Its eyes glowed red as it looked at Charles. Charles was clearly losing his strength at this point. There was a cluster of black fog wrapped around his body. He didn't move at all. He didn't struggle. He allowed the black fog to control and invade his body. The lion-headed beast opened its mouth wide, and out came a ball of fire aimed at Charles. "Quickly, help!" Calvin, who hadn't been able to help, immediately responded. He jumped into the battle and stood in front of Charles, muttering under his breath. In a flash, light shone brightly. The heavenly light spell was able to suppress all dark and impure powers. This mutated lion-headed beast was considered an impure object. When it had encountered light element spells that were countered by natural attributes, it naturally wouldn't be good. The black flames evaporated, disappearing into thin air. Although light attribute spells were mostly auxiliary in nature, their natural suppression of impure objects proved a huge advantage. The eyes of the lion-headed beast seemed to be blinded, snapping tightly shut. "Hurry and attack it!" Calvin Bell shouted. Zach and Denny had been waiting for a long time. Small fireballs rained down one after another. Long arrows suffused with a faint gray glow smashed into the lion-headed beast. Although the lion-headed beast's body was tough, it was still made of flesh and blood, so the endless attacks still had some effect. It wasn't, however, as stiff as the zombie, which had lost its life force. Blood and scratches appeared on the lion-headed beast's body. In the end, it was a Tier 1 medicinal that awakened. The strength of the medicinal spiritual strength was limited. Under this kind of high-intensity consumption, it only lasted for 10 or so seconds before its attacks slowed down. "The recoil is insufficient," Denny said, panting. "There must be a way to block it for a while, once Charles wakes up," Zach said, comforting him. "You are right." Denny could only watch helplessly as Charles blew up the lion-headed beast. Although he didn't know what kind of method Charles had used, the scene just now had the greatest impact on him in the first half of his life. It showed a person facing a huge monster and actually taking a risk without fear, risking his own life for an opportunity. Denny felt sincere admiration. If it were him, he wouldn't have been able to do it. He didn't know that Charles dared to do this because he was confident. However, what surprised Charles was the fact that his blood essence wasn't strong enough. At that moment, his inner demon had successfully entered his body. At the same time, the soul-devouring black energy was wending its way through his body. Unless his life force was gone, this black energy would forever attach itself to his body. Charles's body had already lost control. His mind had fallen into a murky state, but the pain was still there. He didn't know why he felt pain. A light suddenly lit up in front of his pitch-black eyes, making him squint. After adapting to the light, he looked forward. Who is it? He saw many people, but couldn't recognize or see them clearly. Who were they? Who am I? A person wearing white armor and holding a long spear appeared in front of him. After a moment, Charles could clearly make out the individual. It was him. Charles saw it clearly and gritted his teeth. He wanted to rush forward and fight this man to the death. However, the man just looked at him from afar and laughed out loud. After that, he killed one of the people in the crowd. The man was the captain of his exorcist squad. "Captain!" Charles shouted. Another person fell to the ground. It was Charles's father. "Father!" The spearman kept killing people one after another, and their screams were torture to Charles, who wanted to cry but couldn't. He also wanted to pounce, but his body refused to move at all. He was in crippling pain. Another person fell to the ground, startling Charles. Alice? His heart began to echo. No, you can't die. No one can kill the person I saved, he thought. I won't allow it. I won't allow it. They aren't dead yet. There's still hope. The spear is in front. The fist is behind. Blinded with rage, Charles threw a punch at the white armored man. In the eyes of others, Charles seemed to have fallen into some painful memory from which he shouted, "Captain!" Captain? What captain? Everyone was puzzled. The black gas grew more vigorous, and Charles's pain increased exponentially. Everyone was listening, waiting for the truth. They didn't know what had happened to Charles. Wrapped in the black fog, what exactly did he see? Someone tried to wake him up. "Charles!" Charles was shocked. "Alice? No!" He roared as he madly charged in all directions. "You can't die!" A red tide appeared on Alice's face, which was drenched in sweat. Blue light flickered on her body as she blocked the monster mosquito's attack. She looked at Charles with a dazed look in her eyes. Charles clenched his fists as he ran toward the lion-headed beast. An incomparably powerful aura suddenly erupted from his body, which made everyone in the monsters present tremble. Everyone was stunned and asking questions. What realm was Charles in? Second rank? Third step? Not only that, could it be... was it the saint level, given his incredible knowledge? The black energy on Charles's body disappeared quietly as his huge fist smashed down. The lion-headed beast was hit by the fist, and its body actually flattened. It was like an enormous lion carpet. It spun immediately. The ground cracked, and the lion-headed beast fell, defeated. First layer, level 2! He continued smashing all the way to the bottom level. The huge mouth of the abyss was actually connected to the ground from the roof. What kind of strange power is this? Oh my god! Everyone was stunned and didn't understand what had happened. Charles had punched through the entire building. Looking down, there was no movement from that lion-headed beast. It seemed that it was already dead. Everyone looked at Charles, who was frozen in place. That seemingly ordinary fist. How was this possible? Subconsciously, they swallowed their saliva. What kind of warrior is he if he can't protect the people around him? I'm doing the best I can here, Charles roared, wiping sweat from his brow. His body was like a gust of wind. He was a walking typhoon. It swept toward the monsters, and one punch after another landed. Charles was like a robot that didn't compute fatigue. Fists and monster mosquitoes. One punch, one black iron mantis. These monsters were indeed terrifying, but the Charles in front of them was even more terrifying. The monsters were actually scared and began to flee in all directions. After all, they could fly. The few remaining Mantia nigras and medicinal monster mosquitoes disappeared as well, trundling off as quickly as they could. Charles landed on the highest spot on the balcony. A cold wind blew past him, ruffling his torn clothes. He truly looked like a superhero, and the students below gathered around him, seemingly in awe. "Charles!" cried one student. "Just how—" He turned around, his eyes still closed. He had never opened his eyes since the beginning of the battle. He started, and then fell down. Charles lay flat on the ground. Alice ran up in a panic, not saying anything. The spiritual strength had caused her to collapse, but she didn't care about her own body at all. Boundless blue light surged out of her, ultimately gathering in and around Charles's body. "Girl, you've used too much energy. Don't use your superpower anymore. This way you'll die of exhaustion." Miranda grabbed Alice's left arm from behind and stopped her. "He must have recovered just now," she said. "Miranda, in the end, he called my name. I don't know what he saw in the black fog just now, but Charles, he called my name in the end." When Alice turned her head, Miranda saw it clearly. The traces of tears on her face. Miranda didn't know why Alice would cry, but she could guess that her journey might be different from Alice's. However, she was also terribly worried about Charles at the moment. Miranda swore that she would never forget what had happened just now. He was like a hero who saved the world. The hero that she'd always yearned for. She'd always liked to talk big, like the Supreme Treasure, and like the Purple Clouds. Since ancient times, beauties have been matched with heroes, and she wanted one for herself. Charles may have been crude, but he was a hero. Like Captain America himself. Especially that punch. For a moment, Miranda's feelings for Charles were indescribable. As she walked toward him, she said, "Don't worry, Charles. She'll definitely be fine." Then she squatted beside Charles, her outstretched hand visibly trembling. When her index finger reached Charles's nose, a wave of heat rushed to her skin, and a relieved smile appeared on her face. She hurriedly said, "I'm fine. I'm still angry, though." "Miranda, let me do it. As a light power possessor, I'm best at healing," Calvin said, walking out of the crowd. A holy light descended from the sky, landing on Charles's body. Under the illumination of the holy light, he looked somewhat divine. The rays of light seeped into his skin and entered his body. Charles trembled slightly. "There's a reaction!" shouted Zach, his serious face revealing a trace of joy. After a while, Charles stopped and didn't respond to Calvin. Calvin let out a long, shaky sigh. Although he'd used up the least amount of energy in the battle just now, the 2 minutes of treatment had made him feel weak and mentally deficient. "Rest for a while. I can't tire you to death anymore." Miranda raised her eyebrows and made Calvin stop. She immediately looked at the lifeless students around her. There had been more than 300 students before. Now, there were less than 100 of them left. On her left, a male student knelt on the ground wailing. He was manic but powerless as he pounded the ground. In front of him was the shriveled corpse of a female student. Miranda shook her head, feeling a sense of desolation in her heart. However, just as quickly, she grew excited again. Now was not the time to be crestfallen. As the vice president of the student council, she felt that at the moment, she needed to stand up and embrace her role. "Students, let's make our way down," she said. Then, after thinking for a moment, she continued, "There's a big classroom on the 5th floor. Let's go rest first, and after that, we'll make plans." The others didn't say a word, but silently followed Miranda, their leader. In front of Charles wasn't the lion-headed beast. There was only one enemy in front of him now. A white armored man holding a long spear. The white armored man who had awakened the spear-type body technique was Charles's old enemy in his previous life. After Charles's death, this man still lived in a carefree manner. This was Charles's most painful memory. Everything was because of this man. His name was Leonard Shaw, and Charles had sworn to kill him. Now that he saw him again, how could Charles differentiate between illusion and reality? There was only one thought in his mind. Kill him. Kill him. He had to be killed. Charles burst forth, drawing on the last of his energy and throwing a punch at Leonard. Leonard didn't even attempt to dodge. He took the punch head on. In the eyes of every third party, it was Charles who punched the lion-headed beast through more than 10 floors. The strength of the punch penetrated his body and caused the creature to die on the spot. In reality, Charles had hit a hard shell. His fist was shaking and aching, but he couldn't stop. He punched again. Leonard, with his white armor gleaming, just stood there, not moving at all, as if Charles hadn't done a thing. Charles kept punching him until Leonard laughed out loud. He didn't say a single word, but the ear-piercing laughter was no different from the most heart-piercing ridicule to Charles. Charles was stunned on the spot, watching Leonard slowly leave, disappearing from his sight. Charles wanted to chase after Leonard. However, it was as if he was bound by a heavy chain. He couldn't walk anymore, not even a single step. No, thought Charles. How could he? How can I stay here? I want revenge. Leonard! Come back here! He roared at the sky. The shackles were still there, but he couldn't break free. Suddenly, a blue light flashed across the horizon. He saw it and could perceive a familiar scent. It was the smell of Alice. whom he had saved. "Alice, where are you? Is that you?" The surroundings remained deathly silent. There was no response, and he once again fell into a daze, looking up at the endless sky. Then, a medicinal holy light rained down from the heavens, shining on his body. He immediately felt the heavy burden under his feet become much lighter. He tried to move his body, and at last, it responded. He moved an inch forward. What was that? He was burning with curiosity. The shackles binding his body became lighter and lighter. He felt that he could break free at any time. However, the holy light suddenly stopped and disappeared. Where was the light? "Give me the light!" he shouted. However, he wasn't really making a sound. The heavy burden once again pressed down on his body. It was even heavier than before. He didn't know what was going on, or who he even was. He could only recognize the dead faces subconsciously. They looked at him from afar with untold resentment flashing in their eyes. Every time he met their gazes, his body would tremble, so he did his best to avoid them. However, he couldn't help but want to take a look. Can it still possibly work? He asked himself. Miranda led her classmates to the big classroom on the 8th floor and met up with Principal Lee and the others. This was originally the student council meeting room. The tables and chairs, the papers and documents, it was all still there. The students who had rushed into the room swept all the clutter off the table, making space for themselves. Meanwhile, the tables and chairs began to merge. After tidying up the place, everyone squatted on the ground and looked at Principal Lee and Director Benson in front of them. There was a brief moment of silence that made them heave a sigh of relief. Miranda thought for a moment and was about to speak when Principal Lee stood up from his chair. Halfway there, he felt a pain in his leg and squatted back down. With a face full of cold sweat, he said, "First, students, thank you for your hard work." Seeing everyone's tired faces, he coughed dryly and continued, "Just now, you guys fought a bloody battle. I, Michael Lee, also saw it." These words were true, though he had no idea how they'd managed to claim victory. Whatever the case, with such power, they might be able to keep him safe. "It hurts my heart when I think about how you guys are fighting with those monsters. As the principal, I can't help but tear up." For a moment, Principal Lee felt a little awkward since his emotional outburst didn't get a response. Then, under Director Benson's gaze, he changed his tone and said, "A great reward. A great reward. In the future, I'll approve certificates for all of you. Certificates noting your excellence and fitness for any institution." The students still didn't say a word. Finally, a dissatisfied voice asked, "When we were fighting those monsters on the roof, Principal Lee, what were you and Director Benson doing exactly?" The loud voice belonged to Tony. Some of the students in the crowd lowered their heads. They were the people who had followed Principal Lee. The room was silent for a moment, before it exploded into myriad conversations. "Doomsday! This is the end of the world! Those monsters! I saw the monster mosquito drain Hannah White's blood with my own eyes. I was right there." "That's right. Alice, Tony, Miranda, and Dale all rushed over. Why didn't we see Principal Lee?" "People who are afraid of death. Why are you trying to boss us around?" "Yeah, who cares if you're the principal or not? You don't deserve to be the leader." "Hell no, he doesn't. Why are you acting like a wolf with a big tail here? What's the point of a stupid certificate if you're dead? Bastard Michael Lee, you don't have the right to be our leader." What was going on with these students? Why did they suddenly change so much? "Everyone calm down," Lee said smoothly. "What are you guys doing?" Director Benson asked, looking at the 4 strong men walking toward him. He was a little scared and slowly stepped back. Just then, one of the students pushed him to the ground as a group of people surrounded him, punching and kicking. "I'll beat you to death, you spineless lackey!" Naturally, Principal Lee's situation wasn't much better. He was surrounded. She could clearly see what kind of person Principal Lee was, and Miranda wasn't impressed. She already had some opinions when he stopped her from chasing Charles upstairs. However, after their bloody battle, the old man jumped out again, trying to use his identity as the principal to lead everyone. Dream on, Miranda thought. If he really had any good ideas, she could accept it. But the bastard just spewed a bunch of nonsense. At a time like this, he was still trying to play the same tricks as before. He didn't even mention anything about stopping the other students from protecting him because he was too scared. He didn't care in the least about saving the other students. It would be strange if the students weren't angry. Now that he was doing this, and the students were venting their anger on him, the hostility in their hearts was only increasing. However, in the end, it was still a human life. Regarding Lee and Benson, who were already spitting up blood, Miranda looked at Dale askance. Dale nodded in understanding, and a layer of gray mud wall appeared around their bodies. Enough. If you keep this up, Principal Lee and Director Benson are going to die, shouted Miranda. The students, who were almost done venting their anger, saw that the two men were at death's door, so they stopped. Since you're not convinced of Principal Lee, then please select a suitable person, boomed Miranda. Without leadership, we're doomed to fail. We need to make decisions as one, so pick whoever you think is best. In my opinion, Miss Miranda should be the one to do it. Alice agreed, saying, After all, you are our teacher. We all know how you usually behave. You have leadership experience and aren't surprised when dealing with things. You also have body technique and special abilities. I'm willing to listen to you. Alice's help was timely. Miranda gave her a look full of praise. Alice smiled at her and looked at the other students, who murmured in seeming agreement. Miss Miranda, a man said, you're the only one who's stronger than Zach and Charles. Yeah, Zach isn't suitable to be the leader, and Charles is still in a coma lying next door. We can't choose anyone other than you. Miranda followed the words of her classmates and didn't decline. Okay, since my classmates think highly of me, then I'll do it. But you'll need to listen to my commands, or this will never work. No problem, said most of the students readily. Miranda looked at Principal Lee and Director Benson wailing behind them, and then at Calvin. Calvin understood and stepped forward. He had recovered a little of his spiritual strength, which was more than enough to treat the two of them. With a flash of golden light, they were both enveloped by the holy light. This feeling. The two of them quickly recovered from their injuries. Principal Lee, Director Benson, please sit with the other students. The two of them had just suffered a great loss, so they didn't dare to say anything. They lowered their heads and sat in a corner. Next, let's discuss how to proceed. I think we should wait for reinforcements in the teaching building. Yes, I believe the government will definitely have a way. Miranda thought so too. However, after awakening her superpower knowledge and witnessing Charles's shocking outburst, her perspective shifted. She no longer believed that there would be an official rescue. This was also the reason why she no longer cared about the principal or director's titles. The only rescue that could possibly come would be an atomic bomb, and that wouldn't be much help to them. She just shook her head. It was useless to think about it. All right, let's just pretend that there'll be a rescue later. But before that, shouldn't we defend ourselves against the monster's attacks while ensuring our survival? One of the students raised her voice. What do we need for survival right now? Food, water, and sleep, Miranda said, hitting the nail on the head. The students were silent. They opened their eyes wide and waited for Miranda to continue. Miranda was so calm, infectiously so. She was like a general, and the students immediately felt they'd made the right decision in electing her. Zach had previously gone to the supermarket with his classmates to get food and water. Currently, he still had some in storage, but going by the current crowd, it was only enough for a day. Moreover, they'd only be half full, at best. They definitely wouldn't be able to sleep well either. There were no warm blankets, only cold, hard wooden tables and chairs. So the first thing we need to do right now is getting out of the teaching block and back to the dormitory. Miranda herself was helpless. When Zach had rescued her from the dormitory building, she might have instructed the others to grab their bedding, but a person couldn't blame her. When staring down death, one's first thought isn't generally blankets and pillows. Then before that, can you let us have a bite? Said one student. I'm starving, said another. Me too. Miranda subconsciously looked at her watch. It was already 7 in the morning. She looked out the window and found that it was still pitch black, and the sun hadn't risen yet. Miranda arranged for everyone to eat. She discussed the matter with Zach and the others, took some food and water, and distributed everything in equal portions. After temporarily filling her own stomach, Miranda divided the students into 12 classes. There were about 10 people in each class, and they would guard the place in shifts. After completing these arrangements, Miranda let out a long sigh of relief. These things really consumed a lot of energy and mental strength. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. She ventured into Charles's room, where she found Calvin and Alice treating him, and Zach lying beside Charles with his eyes closed, fast asleep. Dale followed behind Miranda, and noting the way that she was hunching over, said in a deep voice, "Miss Miranda, you should also rest for a while." Miranda nodded, and leaning to the side, she curled up and closed her eyes. Dale also leaned against the wall and took a nap. With Denny and the Class 1 students standing guard outside, they could indeed relax for a while and recover. Regardless of whether it was the loss of physical strength or the loss of medicinal spiritual strengths, they were running low now, even overloaded. They were all people who had just awakened their superpowers. This was just a Tier 1 realm, and the medicinal spiritual strength was still very weak.